Welcome to the Gay Therapy LA podcast, the show that empowers gay men to live their fullest, healthiest lives. Whether you're navigating relationships, mental health, intimacy, finances, career, or personal growth, Ken Howard, a licensed clinical social worker in California, certified psychiatric social worker, and ASEC certified sex therapist, is here to guide you with over 30 years of experience, specializing in gay male individuals, couples, and polycules. As the founder of GayTherapyLA.com and GayCoachingLA.com. And now, today's episode.
Hi, I'm Ken Howard, and welcome to the Gay Therapy LA podcast. Today, I want to talk about gay men and Trump 2.0, coping with anxiety. In December of 2004, at the time of the re-election of President George W. Bush, the son of President Bush, who was president from 1988 to 1992, I wrote an article for ANU, Art and Understanding, America's AIDS magazine, where I had a monthly column for that publication for several years, advocating for HIV/AIDS mental health and indirectly gay men's mental health. And I wanted to repeat part of that article here, and I want to encourage you to consider how these words from back then might apply to the current situation, 20 years later, of the re-election of President Donald Trump on November 5th, 2024, just a little while ago. So here's the excerpt from what I wrote 20 years ago. A second Bush presidency in the third decade of HIV. Now what? From December 14th, 2004. What does the re-election of President George W. Bush mean for the mental health of people living with HIV/AIDS? That's a complicated question. While certainly not all people living with HIV in the United States were supporters of Bush's challenger, Senator John Kerry, many, some would say most, were. Because Democrats have traditionally been the party more of a friend to PWAs, people living with HIV and AIDS, than Republicans have been. This is probably because many people living with HIV/AIDS are gay men, people who live in urban centers as well, women, young people, people of color, and people with strained resources and inadequate access to full health care, all Democratic stronghold issues. So the re-election of Bush probably represents an enormous sense of disappointment for these constituents and their interests. In addition to disappointment, there may be shock. How could John Kerry lose after winning 3 televised debates? Bush's approval rating in his first term was below 50% right before the election. The U.S. experienced a net loss of jobs between 2000 and 2004 and a major controversial war in Iraq. There also may be helplessness and even rage, and certainly a fear that new Bush policies in a second term will practically guarantee that people living with HIV and their needs will not be adequately met over the next 4 years. For many living with HIV, the disappointment and shock of the election's results can easily give way to depression. One genesis of depression is when a person desperately wants to escape or change their situation and yet is helpless to change it. These frustrated efforts can give way to despair. This must be how many John Kerry campaign volunteers from the HIV and LGBT and other minority communities have felt in their fight, seeing their hopes go up in smoke, like prescription drug access reform, increased access to a full range of healthcare services, threatened reauthorization and funding of local Ryan White Care Act services such as mental health or case management or treatment education or housing. All of things the new Republican majority House and Senate will vote on in 2005. HMO reform, immigration policies, and certainly the threat or real loss of civil union and domestic partner rights in states that approve ballot measures to not only prevent gay marriage, but to strip legal status of civil unions and domestic partnerships as well. Unfortunately, there are many potential new policies of Bush and lost policies of Kerry to mourn that affect the lives of many people in very real, very personal, specific ways. What isn't loss, which contributes to depression, can be the threat of loss, which contributes to anxiety. In both depression and anxiety, we must mobilize our internal cognitive resources to cope. This means we must change the way we think in order to change the way we feel. One of the best antidotes for anxiety is to take action, any action, that proves to our inner selves that we are not helpless. People can focus on the positive things that are still left in their lives, seeing friends, spending time with family, and trying to do rewarding and productive work. They can become active in local politics, such as serving on consumer advisory boards of nonprofit organizations, serving on a board of directors, volunteering for campaigns for congressional elections in the midterms in 2 years in 2006. If they are gay or bisexual, they can come out to family and friends and colleagues, which has proven to be effective in influencing socially conservative people away from voting for draconian anti-gay measures if they know someone personally close to them who is LGBT whose life would be negatively affected. They can do this through letter writing campaigns or public speaking engagements, public demonstrations, legal actions, or write a magazine column, right? We can also do what we've been doing for many years, especially during Republican administrations of the 1980s, early in the AIDS epidemic that hurt so many people living with HIV for so long. We can take actions despite the dominant paradigm in power and prove that the power of the people speaking out must be reckoned with. That sense of self-empowerment, which began with those brave, early people living with AIDS volunteers of ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, is critical for survival because silence equals death. And we can wait for someone to emerge in 2008 who champions our issues once again and throw our full support behind them, whoever that turns out to be. Even if the current leadership enacts many policies that hurt us, there is a way for all of us in our personal, meaningful, and specific ways to demonstrate a resistance that preserves our personal empowerment and prevents despair. And unlike HIV medication viral resistance, this kind of resistance is a good thing. The ability to act effectively in the face of duress builds our capacity for adaptive coping and helps us to develop an increased sense of compassion that we can model for others, including maybe our current president. Okay, so that was back then. That was from the article that I wrote in December of 2004. And I find it part amusing and maybe part horrifying that so much of the sentiment from my previous article is so applicable today in 2024 with Trump's re-election. Notice how I mentioned gay men, people who live in urban centers, Democratic blue cities, they would say, women, certainly, young people, people of color, and people with strained resources and inadequate access to health care. Notice how I questioned how John Kerry could lose after seemingly winning televised debates, or the previous incumbent's approval rating being below 50% before the election. The U.S. experience of a net loss of jobs during Trump's first administration from 2016 to 2020, and the new Republican majority House and Senate coming in. Gay Australian singer Peter Allen had a hit song with his cover of Everything Old is New Again. And here we are. Consider those similarities. Notice how also I mentioned the disappointment and shock of the election's results can easily give way to depression when the genesis of depression is said to be when a person desperately wants to cope or escape or change a situation and yet feels helpless to change it. I'm not thrilled about animal experiments, but they did this with rats in a box in an experiment. After trying to escape for a while, the rats gave up trying to escape, and they didn't try again, even after the latch had been unlocked and they could have just left. These frustrated efforts then give way to despair. But perhaps as the greatest Democratic president ever said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That was Franklin Roosevelt, who was president from 1932 to 1945, who was elected to 4 terms before Congress instituted term limits for presidents. Clinical social workers like me often encourage our clients to identify adaptive coping strategy for any life stressor they encounter. We always can ask ourselves, now, what are the adaptive coping strategies for the re-election of Trump, one of the most virulently anti-gay presidents in the history of the country? Human Rights Campaign on their website outlines these. FenwayHealth.org outlines the Trump administration anti-LGBT policies. There's one in theconversation.com about LGBT rights where Trump and Vance stand, and another one that outlines Donald Trump's worst LGBTQ attacks. Trump is by no means a pro-gay president, and those who say that he is are mistaken. He has appointed in his first cabinet and now in anticipation of the second cabinet some of the most virulently anti-gay figures in our current government. With the re-election of Trump, the commitment to reverse marriage equality rights, which, 2/3 of Americans now support marriage equality, the emphasis has shifted to being more anti-trans than anti-gay, gay men and lesbians. However, usually the policies that hurt trans people also harm the entire LGBTQ plus community and others as well, such as women, immigrants, people living with HIV, those without health insurance, low-income people, people of color, veterans, the elderly, disabled people, homeless people, children. It's a wide ripple effect when LGBTQ people are harmed by laws and policies because those policies hurt our most vulnerable populations. Really, when you hurt one minority group by way of policies, it really has a ripple effect to hurt all other minority groups. So much of the anxiety regarding Trump's re-election a couple weeks ago is partly what is, such as the appointment on November 12th of Mike Huckabee, a virulently anti-gay governor, as the ambassador to Israel. One of the most virulently anti-gay political figures in recent history is Mike Huckabee and his daughter Sarah Huckabee Sanders. But also what could be is a worry as Trump makes more and more position announcements even ahead of his re-inauguration in January 2025, which is just a couple months away as of today in mid-November 2024. The appointment just yesterday of Pam Bondi from Florida as the Attorney General. Pam Bondi was known to be very anti-gay and in allyship with Ron DeSantis about the Don't Say Gay law and fighting marriage equality. She has tried to make pro-gay statements just to kind of stave off criticism, but her actual policies were very much in support of the anti-gay policies of Ron DeSantis in Florida, and she'll bring that bigotry to a national level as Attorney General. Clinically, anticipatory anxiety can be more subjectively painful than what it actually turns out to be, because a sense of threat activates our psychological defenses and our automatic nervous system, such as cortisol and adrenaline, the flight or fight or freeze response. And it could cause hypervigilance, this feeling that you're on edge and that you have to watch your back against threats. And this keeps us chronically on high alert to threats to our well-being, even without knowing what those harms are yet. Anxiety is sometimes defined as the fear of loss. As gay men, we legitimately fear losing our rights and protections that we currently have, as well as being denied further rights in the future which we have been advocating for, such as more comprehensive workplace and consumer protections, against religious freedom businesses that want the legal permission to discriminate against us as a group. Even this week in the news, there's been movements by Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, to stop the use of trans people using the restroom in the national Capitol according to their gender identity. There was a meme that had a photo of a trans man, with tattoos and a beard and muscles, and a trans woman, with beautiful hair and makeup and jewelry. And the meme said, according to this, he would be going in the women's room and she would be going to the men's room. Just makes complete nonsense. It's also said that the opposite of anxiety is safety. When a threat has been eliminated, as much as a threat can ever be, then we can feel safe again. So, as a gay male community, we're making progress to expand all of our rights to full equality with others under the law. With the re-election of Trump and the historically virulently anti-gay Republican congressional majorities, now in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, where, House Speaker Mike Johnson is the most overtly Christian nationalist politician and anti-gay speaker in the history of Congress. So we're not likely to make a lot of progress with a Republican majority House and Senate, and we'll be lucky if we don't lose considerable ground, making us less safe, more vulnerable, and even more designated as second-class citizens in America compared to heterosexuals. Part of Trump's Project 2025 by the very conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, long known as a virulently radical anti-gay group, is the goal of eliminating all protections against discrimination for LGBT people in employment, housing, education, the military, public services, which is in part anti-gay and in part, quote-unquote, pro-business, because businesses don't want to be sued for damages for anti-LGBT discrimination. So removing those discrimination protections protects them from having to pay out damages in lawsuits. So in a way, it's pro-business, so they can't be sued, preserving their profits, which is a high priority for that new administration. Part of anxiety management is realizing that anxiety is a more clinical term for just worry. And as the saying goes, you can't worry your way to safety. Worrying or not will not affect the outcome of something outside your control. The wisdom of bumper stickers on cars is often salient, which includes the adage, hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and take what comes with a smile. Another saying that I've used with clients, just little things to remember to manage on a day-to-day basis, is action is antidotal to anxiety. If the government's new legal systems want to take rights away, the way we fight it is through public education and public sentiment and through the rather boring legal aspects of the courts. Remember, the Supreme Court case that gave us national marriage equality was actually a lawsuit from a rich lesbian who didn't want to pay additional inheritance tax that she would not have had to pay had she been married to her same-sex partner. It was a sentimental idea about love is love, as Obama famously said, but it was actually a tax savings idea for someone who's rather privileged. But, who cares as long as it gets us marriage equality? But it did start out with something very technical, like taxes. The late Harvey Milk, who was supervisor in San Francisco, who was murdered in the 70s, used to advocate for gay men to just be out. The more the general public knows about LGBT people in their life, very specifically at the local level, the more it demystifies us and helps them to empathize with our LGBT people, which makes them overall less inclined to vote against our rights. That's been researched. Marriage equality was certainly that way. After lots of straight people started knowing same-sex couples, as friends or in their family or their coworkers, and started to attend their weddings, the number of people in America who generally approved of same-sex weddings went from being below 50% to far above 50%. And these days, they just need to get to know more trans kids and understand that they need medical care and to dispel the Republican hysteria that, little boys are going to school and coming home with their penises chopped off by the school nurse, as Trump very specifically touted. And these kinds of myths need not go unchecked. They need to be called out as absurd by our entire LGBT community and certainly by our advocacy organizations like Human Rights Campaign, which I frankly think does a horrible job of educating the public. Meanwhile, the Christian right does a stupendously expert job of miseducating the population with very strong but false facts, quote unquote, about the situation. If you've ever heard Christian radio programs, they're brilliant at misinformation. They're very skilled at it. It's effective. They spout lies, and tens of millions of people believe them. We don't have an education campaign on the LGBT side to the same extent. So lots of people in our country are just left to make up stuff about trans people. They just make it up out of whole cloth. So we reduce anxiety about losing our rights in the cultural battle through a combination of public sentiment and public education and legal proceedings through all the different levels of the courts, which, when you think about it, is how most civil rights changes happen through history. Women getting the right to vote in 1920 after a long campaign that dates back to the 1880s or longer was a legal thing, a constitutional thing. So we can take heart in the long view with another inspirational quote. I've had a lot of worries in my life, most of which never happened. That was from Mark Twain. But what we can do is prepare and do the things that work for us in our value system, whether that's involving ourselves in activism or just living well as best we can, staying out of the fray as much as any of us can ever do, so that we limit the volume of stressful information from all these different news sources that we're exposed to. Especially media hysteria and noise that we can do nothing about. That stuff is largely clickbait and trying to sell, screen time, eyes on apps. And you have to remember, every app and every advertisement and every media form that we're exposed to has something to sell. And good news doesn't sell, and basic news that's neutral does not sell. Bad news sells. It's the old newspaper saying, if it bleeds, it leads. That's what's on the front page. Because people will buy the newspaper. That way they're aroused. Blood arouses people to buy a newspaper or to spend more time on an app and see the ads. So before we had marriage equality that brings with it, thousands of federal and state civil rights automatically for spouses, gay men provided for themselves by entering private contracts, such as a will leaving their money to their partner, or writing and notarizing a formal power of attorney for healthcare decisions, or arranging for joint ownership of real estate or other kinds of property like vehicles. If we fear the most extreme policy changes, such as the loss of marriage equality rights in many states, if the Supreme Court should overturn the Obergefell case, then the action to take would be doing things the way gay men did before any state had marriage equality. That's the workaround. If there is a fear that gay men would be systematically rounded up for internment camps or mass execution, as happened during the European Holocaust between about 1934 and 1945, the coping would be like any other threat to our lives, such as illness or accident or violent crime, not to mention, natural causes. While any socio-political scenario, even the most dystopian, is possible, we might mitigate our worry and anxiety by understanding what is the most likely thing to happen. In the case of Trump's second administration, the hardship is likely to fall on the trans community, such as being denied healthcare services like puberty blockers, especially as children or youth, being denied military service, and being denied civil rights in employment, housing, and access to medical care. And these are all severe hardships, but all of them are subject to actually policy changes that may or may not occur, and all of which could be challenged in the local and state and up to the Supreme Court, or could be just individual policies of employers. Individual employers can decide that they have a non-discrimination policy against LGBT people. And all of these things that happen in the next Trump administration are subject to reversal by a more progressive president and government coming down the pike in Congress, in the Supreme Court, in state governments in the future. Notice how when I was quoting my article from 2004, I speculated. I said, who might come along in 2008 to start to reverse some of the negative policies of a second administration of George W. Bush? And of course, I was referring to Barack Obama, who was, very pro-LGBT. So everything that went on from 2004 to 2008 in some ways was mitigated. I mean, we also had a lot of, bans on marriage equality in states in 2008 that lasted until 2013. My husband and I ourselves were married before Election Day of 2008 when California's Prop 8 came into being. But these things tend to fluctuate, from the left to the right. We can never be too comfortable when the left and progressivism is leading. And fortunately, we can never be too despairing when the right has dominance, because these things do tend to fluctuate by the political will of the nation. So there are a number of inspirational quotes about coping with worry on a website called brainyquote.com and worry quotes. So you might want to visit brainyquote.com for worry quotes to see if there might be inspirational quotes there that you might enjoy, a whole list of them, longer than I can list here. My favorite among pursuing these is this one by an inspirational author popular in the 1980s. Worry never robs tomorrow of its sorrow. It only saps today of its joy. That's from Leo Buscaglia, who is an inspirational kind of self-help author in the 80s. Gay men used to live under far fewer legal civil rights than we have now, and they thrived. If you study your history, like Hollywood history, luminaries like William Haynes and Jimmy Shields, a long, open gay relationship in Hollywood as a Hollywood interior designer. Cary Grant and Randolph Scott. Now, they married women after a while, but in the early 30s, when they lived together in Malibu, it was common knowledge that they were having a relationship. Christopher Isherwood, the great author, who wrote the Berlin stories that Cabaret is based on, and, was there witnessing the rise of Nazism in Germany and Berlin, eventually found his way to Santa Monica, California, and married Don Barkady, who was much, much younger, but they had a fabulous life together for a long time. Tab Hunter and Anthony Perkins, these two hot Hollywood actors who had this, what came later to be known as a great affair, So no matter what for gay men, including the AIDS crisis, we endure. So take heart. We'll get through it. We've done it before, and if we need to, we will again. We move onward. If you need help with some of this for your own anxiety management, your own adaptive coping, please feel free to reach out in California for therapy services and anywhere else for coaching services. You can reach me at 310-339-5778. That's 310-339-5778. Or email me, ken@gaytherapyla.com or ken@gaycoachingla.com. Either one of those will reach me if you'd like to talk about more about how I might help you or you and your partner or partners on a more customized basis. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.